In this video from ITFreeTraining, I will look at the two install options for Active Directory Certificate Services, Standalone and Enterprise. The fundamental difference between the two is one requires Active Directory domain services and the other does not. This video will look at the advantages and features supported depending on which you decide to use in your organization. As stated, this video will look at the differences between a standalone CA and an enterprise CA. At its simplest level, the enterprise CA requires domain services and thus must be a member of the domain. The standalone CA does not require any additional services to operate. Normally, for this reason, a standalone CA will be installed on a server that is not a member of the domain. It could be installed on a member server if required. In most cases, it will not be because being standalone gives you the option to take the server offline and start it only when required. It is a common practice with standalone root CAs to take them offline when they are not required. In contrast to the enterprise CA, that CA needs to be online. It does not mean that it has to have 100% uptime and cannot be taken down for maintenance. But what it does mean is that it should not be taken offline for extended periods of time. It is not uncommon for standalone root CAs to issue a few certificates and then be taken offline for years at a time. Since an enterprise CA has to be a member of the domain and uses the Active Directory database, it needs to be online at least most of the time. Having the enterprise CA online, or any CA online for that matter, does present a security risk. The CA contains private keys, which, if an attacker were to get a hold of, would compromise every certificate that was issued below that CA in the certificate hierarchy. In the case of a standalone root CA, once it is offline, it is easy to protect by placing media in a secure area like a safe or physically locking up the server. For this reason, the choice of which CA to choose often comes down to what service it is providing. For a standalone CA, you will most likely find it used to provide external certificate services. External services means certificates for users outside the company or directly to the Internet. If the CA needs to be accessible via the Internet, a standalone CA is the better choice. If an attacker were to gain access to the CA, they would not be able to gain access to the domain since the standalone CA does not need to be a member of the domain. Since an enterprise CA needs to be a member of the domain, it is a better choice for internal networks. Being on an internal network means that it is not directly accessible on the Internet and can also be placed behind a firewall. This brings up the point, if a standalone CA is easier to protect, why use an enterprise CA at all? Using an enterprise CA does give you more features at the cost of making it harder to keep secure. The most noticeable is that a standalone CA can only offer manual services. This essentially means that all certificates must be approved before they can be used. In contrast to an enterprise CA, an enterprise CA can use the trust relationship that is created when a computer is added to the domain. For this reason, an enterprise CA can use this trust relationship to automatically provide certificate services to clients in the domain without the certificate needing to be approved first by an administrator. To put it another way, a client can request a certificate from an enterprise CA and have it automatically be approved, and the client can start using it right away. In a standalone CA, a client would need to request a certificate, and then an administrator would need to approve the certificate for issuing before the client could start using it. The last difference is that since a trust relationship exists when a computer is added to the domain, a certificate that is issued via an enterprise CA will automatically be trusted by the client receiving the certificate. With a standalone CA, the certificate authority must be manually trusted before the certificate can be used by the client. This does not mean that the client receiving the certificate from the standalone CA cannot be a member of the domain. What it does mean is that since the standalone CA is not part of a domain, the domain trust model cannot be used to allow the client to automatically trust a certificate issued from the Standalone CA. If, for example, all your clients were members of a domain and you were using a Standalone CA, you could use group policy to configure all your clients to automatically trust the Standalone CA. The point to remember is that clients receiving certificates from a Standalone CA will not be able to automatically start using the certificates until they are configured to trust the Standalone CA. It is important to understand the difference between a Standalone CA and an Enterprise CA, so I will now go through an example of each. In this example, a Standalone CA is created. To protect the root Standalone CA, a second subordinate CA is created. In later videos, I will cover how subordinate CAs work. For the present, think of it as a CA that can issue certificates on behalf of the root CA to clients. In order for the subordinate CA to issue certificates, the root CA will issue it a certificate. Once a certificate is issued, the root CA can be taken offline. You can see how since the standalone root CA can easily be taken offline when not required, if no additional subordinate CAs are added to the network, the root standalone CA may be offline permanently and put in a secure location. Since the root CA contains private keys that are, pardon the pun, the keys to the network, having it offline protects these keys. The subordinate CA is free to issue certificates without the root CA being online and does not require access to the root CA private keys in order to issue certificates. You can see that by using a standalone CA how easy it is to have excellent security. In later videos, I will go into more detail about how a CA can form hierarchies to create certificates. If I were to add the rest of the network in, you can see how a typical standalone CA deployment would work. The standalone subordinate CA can be placed on a DMZ or perimeter network that is accessible to the Internet. This CA is not on the internal network, so if it were to be attacked, an attacker would not be able to use this server to access the internal network. Now, a third party can put in a request to have a certificate created on the standalone subordinate CA. In order for the certificate to be issued, an administrator would need to approve the certificate before it will be issued. Until this is done, the request will sit in the pending requests queue on the certificate authority. You can see that the advantage of using a standalone CA is it is very easy to secure. The disadvantage is that certificates will need to be approved before they can be issued. This is because without an approval system, the CA does not know who is asking for the certificate and if they can be trusted. In cases like the one shown, the third party will be issued a certificate that will not expire for a decent amount of time. This cuts down on the amount of time an administrator will need to spend allowing certificates. Next, let's consider an Enterprise CA example where the CA is integrated into the domain. In this example, a user wants to connect up to a wireless hotspot to connect to the company's network. In order to secure the wireless hotspot, you want to use certificates. When the user connects to the wireless hotspot, their username and password is checked, and a certificate is issued from the Enterprise CA. Certificates can be used for services like wireless, smart cards, and network access protection. Network access protection, or NAP, is a system that will issue health certificates to clients based on whether the client meets a number of checks, such as if antivirus is installed. If you use any of these systems, depending on how large the network is, hundreds or even thousands of certificates could be needed every day. A standalone CA would not work for such a system because every certificate would need to be approved by an administrator before it could be issued. For services like wireless, the user wants to be connected right away, so waiting for an administrator to allow them access is not practical. In this case, the user can be checked by using their username and password to ensure that they are who they say they are. Once checked, the certificate adds security to the connection, and the user can use this certificate to access other systems on the network. The last question you may see between a standalone and Enterprise CA is, can you combine the two giving you additional security and the features you want where you want them? The answer is yes, you can. In later videos, I will be setting up a certificate hierarchy to make use of Standalone and Enterprise CAs. To do this, you would first install your root Standalone CA. This contains the private keys that form the backbone of your certificate hierarchy. If these were lost, the root CA certificate would have to be recreated and every certificate that has been created revoked and reissued. If I now add the rest of the network, you can see that there is a standalone subordinate CA that is located on the DMZ and an enterprise CA located on the internal network. Once the CAs are installed, the root CA needs to create a certificate for each of these CAs. These certificates would be installed on the Standalone CA and the Enterprise CA. Once these are installed, the root CA is not required again unless another CA needs to be added to the network. For this reason, after the certificates are issued, it can be taken offline. To protect the root CA, some companies will install the root CA on a removable media like a USB hard disk, and then place the root CA in a safe to protect it. When a new CA is required to be added to the network, it is removed from the safe to create the certificate for the new CA and then placed back in the safe afterwards. This covers the basics of a Standalone and Enterprise CA. I hope you've enjoyed this free video from ITFreeTraining. In upcoming videos, I will be explaining more concepts of certificates as well as performing a demonstration of how a certificate infrastructure like this one can be created and used in your organization. All our videos are free and available on YouTube, so consider subscribing to get the latest videos. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.